Hey guys, this is Mitch with Fine Point CGI, and today we're going to talk about how to build a flexible saving and loading system for your game inside of Godot. Now, this is a continuation of my Godot horror game series, so if you haven't ran through all of that, that's okay. It's not going to completely make this useless to you. A lot of the concepts still transfer over, but just make sure that you add in some of the elements that I have. But at least before you start, check out my loading a level tutorial for the horror series as well. So as long as you go through that one first, this one should just work. Now we're going to go through the process of building out our saving system. We're going to go through building out our loading system. Then we're going to jump in and make saving and loading slots thing. So basically we're going to make it so that you can actually click on a loading slot and then load that specific save. And we're going to actually take a picture of your screen so you know where you are in your game. Then we're going to go through and make it really flexible. So basically anything in the scene can get saved and loaded just by adding it to a group and by adding two functions. So it's actually quite simple. Once you get it in, it's really easy to expand it and make it into a big system. And finally, we're going to make a pause menu for our game. Now, it's not necessary for the tutorial fully, but it is nice when you're playing your game to be able to hit escape and actually save and load your game from there. So that's what I have in store for you guys today. So let's go. Okay, so the first thing we have to talk about is some disclaimers. So this tutorial is standalone, but it is also a part of a series. So this is a part of my Godot horror game series. So if you haven't checked that out, you're welcome to. Just go ahead and look it up or check out the playlist that has all of that. But this is standalone, so it should just work even if you don't want to follow that entire 12 hours of tutorial to just get to where we are. So just to let you guys know, this should work one way or the other. We do interact a little bit with the game manager, so that's something to keep in mind. But other than that, it should just work. So with that being said, the first thing that we need to do is we need to actually plan out what our system is going to look like. Now, if you guys remember the overall design of our stuff, and I know it's been a while, but we have a game manager, and that kind of allows everyone to flow through that to communicate to each other, right? So what we'll need to do is we'll need to add in a save manager like this. We'll also need to add in a UI manager if we haven't already. I'll have to check the actual project, but we'll need to have a UI manager to just kind of signal the different UI elements, because part of this tutorial is going over how to actually build a pause menu and how to actually build out a save system that goes with that. So that's something that we're going to have to look at. So in here, we're going to have our main menu and our pause menu. Also, how we're going to get to our save system. Now, our save manager is going to be interact through our game manager. So our pause menu, when you click on the pause and you click like I want to save, it's going to go game manager dot save manager dot save, right? So we'll need the ability to save. We'll need the ability to load like this, like that. And when we do our saving, we're going to need to do a couple of functions. So the first one that we have to do is save the actual scene we're in. So save scene info, which is basically just where we are, things like that. We're also going to need to save player info. And we're also going to need to save our actual object information. Now, when we try to save our stuff out, I also would like to take a picture of our scene. So I'll take a picture so that when we do our UI, we actually have a picture to go with. Because the type of save system I want to do is similar to like Baldur's Gate, where you can actually hit escape, hit save, and you could pick different slots and they have pictures of where you were at that time. I feel like that's a very common system, and it's something that nobody's really explained how to do. So I think that will be useful. When we load our stuff, we need to load our player information. We need to load our scene information, right? And we need to load our object information. Now the thing about saving object information the thing about loading object information is that since the player is not going to be in the scene at the time of loading, we're going to need to lazy load some of this data. So we can load our scene information, our player information, because that's stuff that's already going to be spawned, or that's stuff that's going to be used in loading our actual scene, right? We load our scene, we move our player, and then we need to load in our object info. So if we take our load, let's come in here and let's bring this up. We'll bring this in here. We'll bring this up. And what we'll do when we want to load is first we'll select our scene to load. And then what we'll do is we'll load the scene info, which means we're going to head out to our game manager and tell our game manager to load our scene. And then we'll basically come down here and we'll basically say, okay, once our game manager has loaded our scene, it's going to move our player to where it needs to be. It's going to load the player information and then move the player. And then once it has that, from there, we can actually come in and load and apply scene information. And I think that that's kind of how we're going to approach our loading system. Now, when it comes to saving, thankfully, that's going to be a lot easier because we can basically just save our data. We don't really have to deal with too much. So we can actually just come in here and just grab the scene info. And then we'll save scene info to JSON. And then we'll have to get and save player info. And then we'll need to get all of our actual scene objects. And then we'll need to loop through them. And then we'll need to save them. Now, the way we're going to want to approach this is by basically saying, okay, we're going to be looping through these scene objects, but they all might have different parameters. So I think we're going to need to modify our scene objects to actually have save functions. So I should probably call that out. So save objects with their save function, which means they probably also need to do the same thing here, but with their load function. So we probably need to load and apply and then loop through the scene and then load their objects as well. Something like that is what I'm thinking for the load and save system. I think that's relatively simple. And since we're going to need a pause menu, I imagine, and a main menu, I'm thinking that we're going to need to change our game manager to have some kind of global pause state. So we'll need to look at that. And I think we'll need to look at, and for our pause menu and our main menu, I'm thinking that we can kind of architect it out to look kind of like this. So we have our pause menu, which will be very basic. It'll just basically be like this, very simple. So we'll just add in these guys like this, and we'll have something that says like continue, save, load, maybe an options, and then maybe a exit like that. And that's what I'm thinking that we'll do for kind of like a design. It's not super difficult, and I'm sure we can pretty it up later in the series at some point in time, but I think that'll be the simplest design that we can come up with that will work. Now, when the user clicks on load, I think what we'll do is we'll make a box kind of like this. And I think we'll have a panel right here, which will have the saved game like this. So it'll have the game name like that. And I think we'll have a back button probably here. And then we'll probably have a load button here. That's kind of how they do it in Baldur's Gate as well, is that they have a back and a load button like this. And then we can have a picture of our player right here, or a picture of like the scene that they're looking at. And then maybe we could have some text, kind of like the name of the save like this. And then maybe we could have something like date of save And I think that might do it. So then you get some user information and stuff like that, which means we'll probably need to save that information somewhere. So we probably should come over to our save section. And once it's done looping through these saved objects, we can come here, let's say. Save information like that, and then we'll have maybe some additional save information as well. I think that will probably work. So that's what I'm thinking, is we'll have something like this, we'll have something like this. This is kind of how we're going to approach this, and this is, I think, how we're going to approach our loading and our saving. Now we will need additional stuff. I imagine that we're going to need to have like a load button GD function. I imagine that we're going to need to have some kind of way to manage our state. So I imagine that we'll need to look at that. But I think that that's basically the gist of what I'm thinking that we're going to approach it as. So I guess with that being said, let's go ahead and get started and take a look at this. Okay, so the first thing that you'll notice is that we are not starting from the beginning. Now, as I said before, this is a continuation of the Godot horror game. So I have a link to that in the description below for all of this code. So you can actually just download it and use it for your project, and that's totally fine. Or of course you can walk through the entire project and all of the tutorials that go with it to build out this project. Now, the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to actually build out the saving system. And thankfully, the saving system should be relatively easy to put together. So what we'll do is we'll go into scripting. We're going to file, new script, and I'm going to create a saving utility basically. So I'll pull this over here for us. I'm going to come in here and I'm going to type save load manager like that. And I'm going to make it a .gd. What this is going to be used for is it's going to basically just handle all of our saving and loading for our game. So it's going to be relatively easy. Now, to be able to save and load, we actually need to have a function for that. So we'll come in here and we'll say func save game like that. And we're going to pass in a name of that saved game. Now, when we do our saving, we're going to save out to our user directory. And the easiest way to do that is say var dir is equal to dir access.open, and then we're going to pass in our user ://. Now you might be wondering, okay, where is the user directory? And that's actually really easy. If you go up to project, open user data folder, you'll see that there is a folder right here. And this is your actual project's data folder. And this data folder is created when Godot gets executed. So it's always existing and it's always there. So you can go ahead and store anything that you want the actual player to not have access to, but is not a resource. And Godot basically separates user information from resources by basically having this user folder and by having wherever the project is installed. And so that's kind of the distinction between the two, if that makes sense. Now, we could just store our files right here and be good to go, but what would probably be better is if we actually created a folder called saved games. Now, I'm going to check for that in the code so that way we don't actually need to worry about it when we install it on the end user's machine. So I'm going to say if not dir exists, and I'm going to look for a saved games folder like that. And then if it doesn't, I'm just going to go ahead and make that. So make dir, and I'm going to hit quote save games like that. And now we know that it's going to exist. So we can actually just go dir is equal to dir access dot open quote :// user : / saved games like that. And that'll basically allow us to pull back our saved games. Now we have to get into saving our game. So when we want to save our game, we're supposed to separate our data into 3 different types. If you remember from our design, we said that we were going to save our save data, right? We're going to save our scene data, and then we have some additional save info, right? So we need to basically handle that. So how can we actually save data with Godot? Well, that's actually relatively easy. What we can do is we can just come and say var save bracket, and then we'll go ahead and build out an object. So we'll come in here, we'll say quote game manager colon, bracket, bracket. And this is where we're going to put our game manager information. Now, if we take a look at our game manager, we drag this guy in and we open him up real quick, you can see that we have a link to our level base. We have a link to our player. We have a link to our player scene path, and we have a link to our inventory. So something that we're definitely missing is what scene we actually have loaded. So I'm going to create a variable for that. So I'm going to say var loaded level, like that. And I'm also going to keep track of our spawn index. If you remember, we have a load level function right here, and that basically says, hey, what are we loading and what is the index? So we'll basically pull that back. So we'll say var spawn index. We'll make that a type integer, and then we'll do the same thing here with a type string. And then we'll just come into our load level and we'll basically say loaded level is equal to path. And then we will say spawn index is equal to spawn index. And that'll basically allow us to pull this information whenever we need. And we're more or less going to use it specifically for our save load manager. So we'll go back to our save load manager and we'll say quote scene colon game manager loaded level, comma, quote, spawn index colon game manager spawn index, like that. And then we can actually save our data out. So we'll say var save JSON is equal to JSON.stringify save data. And what this is going to do is it's going to stringify our stuff into JSON. And I'll explain what JSON is as soon as we actually test this out and show you how it works. So don't worry, we'll go through this in about 2 seconds. Once we actually create our JSON, we need to actually create a file, right? So that way we can actually save our game. So how are we going to do that? Well, what we'll do is we'll say var file is equal to file access.open parentheses quote user colon / saved games / plus name plus quote JSON comma file access dot write. And that's basically going to open up our file for writing. So what we're doing here is we're literally saying, I want to create JSON from our saved data. So from this object, I want to create string data. So I want to create text. I want to dump it into JSON, and then I want to create a file located out into my saved games as name.json. And then I want to write that file. Now with file access, you actually have multiple different methods here. So you have write, read, and read, write, and read, write, read. I don't really understand the difference between write, read, and read, write. I think it has to do with some way that it opens the file for faster reading and faster writing. Whichever one's first is the faster one, but I'm not fully sure. So somebody who knows a little bit more about that could probably speak to it. And then all we have to do is basically just store that data. So we can say file.store string, and we'll pass in our save JSON like that. And now we can actually hook up our saved game stuff. So basically, when we want to save a game, we need to populate our loaded level. That means we need to load a level, and we need to have a populated spawn index, right? So we did that in our game manager here, right? So that means that we need to actually load a level. Thankfully, we've already built that out, right? So we have a section here in our control node where we're going out and telling it to load this level at index 0. So what that means is all we have to do, click on our load level, and we should be good. So to set this up, let's go ahead and click on our level base here. Let's right click, add in a child node. Let's add in a button here. Let's go to our 2D scene and let's kind of move this to the upper right hand corner for right now. And let's just type save. And then what I'll do is I'll come into our node here. I'm going to double click on button down. I'm going to put that in my level base, and I will just tell it to save our game. Now we need to get a reference to our save load manager. So we have some options here. We can either go into our project settings and set it as an auto load like we do with our utilities in our game manager, or we can hook it up with our game manager. In my case, I'm just going to do it right here. So we'll click on the file icon. We'll come into our save load manager. We'll click open and we'll click close. And then all we have to do is just go into our level base. We can go into here and say save We'll click add, and then we'll click close. And then all we have to do is come into our code here. We can type save load manager dot save game like that. And it will say too few arguments called. So we'll hit quote test and we'll hit Control S. And now we can hit play on our base game. We'll go ahead and click start game. We'll hit spacebar and you'll see that we are in our game. Now, I did not think this all the way through because it got rid of my button. So what I'm going to do is pull this out into our base game and I'll relink that method. So connect, and I'm going to connect to level base, and then I will refresh and try that again. So start game, spacebar, and we'll hit I and we'll hit save. And hopefully if everything worked out, we didn't get any errors down here. So we'll go to project, open user folder, and you'll see it made a saved games folder. We'll open that guy up and you'll see we have a test.json file. So if I open up VS Code real quick, so VS Code, like so, you can see my GD extension tutorial. Just pick that up real quick. If I drop this in and I open it up, you can see we have game manager seen as empty and spawn index is 0. So at least it's saving data, but it looks like it's not saving it all as we expected. So you can see here, the way JSON works is basically it's a text-based representation of the data that we have. So you can see we have seen, which is empty. We have spawn index, which is 0. And if you look at our base game here, and we go to our load manager, you can see we have game manager scene spawn index. You'll look and you'll see that it's basically an exact carbon copy of that information right here out to a file. And that's nice because that's throwing it out to basically what I like to call cold storage, right? So when it's held in memory, I consider that like hot storage or storage that if the game were to get shut down or something like that, it would lose all that information. But once it's stored in JSON, it is there. It's not going to go anywhere and you're really not going to lose it unless the computer crashes and gets corrupted or something like that. And the nice thing about using JSON is it's really easy to use and it is really easy to, if you need to edit it. Now, I know a lot of people are worried about people going in and changing, information and corrupting files and stuff like that. So I wouldn't necessarily keep your saved game data that is super sensitive here. So for instance, if you were going to be storing stuff like in-game currency, if you had like a pay to win aspect of the game where you got to pay for like premium currency, you wouldn't want to store that here unless it was like an encrypted file or something like that. So that's something to keep in mind. Now, if we take a look at game manager loaded level, we see what it's doing. So if we go to, I believe, game manager here, loaded level is equal to path. So my guess is if I come into here and I refresh real quick, start game, spacebar, it's not even running loaded level. So I got a feeling that that is a thing. Yeah, because this is loading the level immediately right here. So technically, if we wanted to do it correctly, we would want to go through our game manager. So we'd have to go through game manager.load level and then run it through that. And now in theory, that should work. So if I click start game, there we go, hit inventory, save, and then open up my JSON file. So I have to close this guy and then open it up with right here. You will see that it now has my information right here. It has what scene I'm on and what spawn index I'm on, which is really cool. So now you might be asking, okay, well, hold on. Does that mean that if I run over here, I run through here and I open up my door and I load my level to level 2 hallway? If you guys remember, we built a level loading system. We hit spacebar and we hit I, we click save. Does that mean that that information is actually going to get saved? Well, if I open up that JSON file again, you will notice it has been saved, which is awesome. So now we have our stuff actually saving that easy within about 15-20 minutes of my tutorial. It's actually kind of a record. So you can see that it actually does what we need it to do. So how about loading it? What happens when we want to load our data? Well, that's actually relatively easy as well. If I close this guy and I come in here into my save load manager here, I can come in and I can create a function called load game. And I'm going to pass in a name parameter as well, because we're going to want to have multiple save slots. So since we want multiple save slots, we need the ability to pass in the name of our save game when we want to load it. So first things first, what I'm going to do is I'm going to come up to the top and I'm going to make a variable. I'm going to have a loaded game right here, and I'm going to make that a string. And that's basically just going to allow us to keep track of what game we just loaded. And this is for future stuff, but basically the reason why is because if we keep track of what game we loaded, when we need to lazy load any data, know and have a reference to that information. So for us to actually pull our data back, all we have to do, go and grab it. So we basically could just copy this guy, paste it like this. So you'll see we're going to go fetch that information. And then we're going to say var content is equal to file.get as text like that. We'll say var obj is equal to JSON parse string, and we'll pass in that content, and that's going to parse it back into an object, and then we're going to return that obj like that. And now all we have to do is call this. So we could basically just go into our base game like we did, go into our scene here. You can see we have our start game. So if I open that up, I'm going to actually create a button. So I'll just duplicate my start game. I'll drag that guy down and I'll call it load game like that. And then I'll come in here, go into my inspector, change this from start to load game. And then we'll come into our node, right click, disconnect it, right click, connect, and we'll connect it to our control node here. Now, thankfully, this should be relatively quick. We basically could just come in here and say save load manager dot load game, which actually I have loaded. I should say dot load game. There we go. And I'm going to pass in test. Now I'm hard coding this, so we're going to need to clean this up in the future. But for right now, we'll just do that. And then we'll just click base game, hit play, throw a breakpoint on our main menu. Right here, we'll click load game. We'll step into it like this. And then we'll just throw a breakpoint right here and hit play. Now you'll see our object is null. So that's not a good sign. So that means something broke when we did this. So let's see what it's doing. We have a file. Our content is empty, and I think I know why. So if we look at our file access, you'll see that it says write. Well, that means that we're opening up a file and we're expecting to write to it. We're not expecting to get data from it. So we need to open it up with read to be able to read that file. Now, if we take a look at our file, it has completely emptied it because we opened it up as write. So that means that we have to once again save it to get it to work. So we'll hit base game, we'll hit play. We'll come in here, start our game, and I'll get rid of that breakpoint, hit play. I'll run forward like this. I'll come in here, and the reason why I'm doing this is so that we can actually see a nice different level when we load. We'll click save, and then we'll close this. And now if we look at our file, you can see we have our data right here. So now if we come into our main menu here, you'll see that we have our load game right here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say var obj is equal to this. So that way we just have that. And then what I'll do is I'll just pass this into my game manager. So I'll just do this and I'll do obj. And if we look at our test JSON, it's going to be game manager dot scene. So dot game manager dot scene. Like that. Think game manager dot scene, and then same thing, game manager dot spawn index. So obj dot game manager dot spawn index. And then all we have to do, hopefully, is just hit play. We'll click load game. We'll step over. You'll see it's going to return an object. Our object is a dictionary. So if we click on it here, you can see we have a game manager with a scene and a spawn index. So in theory, if everything works the way we expect it to, you can hit step into, and you'll see it's going to pass that data in. So we'll step into, you'll see it says path, level hallway, and spawn index is 0. So hopefully this will work. So we'll hit play, hit the space bar. And you'll see that it says we're going to load our game. Var obj spawn load manager, load game, and load level. Well, wait, didn't we just do this, right? It just ran through this before. And you can see now we have a null value here. So what is going on? Well, what's going on is when we do our load, we need to queue free. We need to pull ourselves out of the actual stack here, or we need to actually hide our scene. So we have a choice on which one we want to do. In my case, what I'm going to do is I'm going to queue free for right now because we don't really have a use for our main menu, at least not right now. And once we get into like having a UI manager and stuff like that to handle our state, that's when things will start being a little bit easier to work with. But for right now, we'll just do it this way. So we'll hit play, and then I will click load game. I'm going to hit spacebar, and you will see that we are actually in the level that we chose. So awesome. Our saving and loading system actually works. Easy enough. So next, what we're going to do is we're going to make a loading menu. So basically, it's going to allow us to have like multiple save slots. And so what we'll do is we'll come into 2D scene. We'll click scene, new scene, and we'll come over here and click user interface. We're going to come in and double click on this guy and type load menu. Then we're going to right click, add a child node. We're going to add in a panel. If you remember our design, we actually had a little loading section here. So we'll pull this guy open. We had a button down here. So we'll right click, add a child node. We're going to add in a button, which I'm going to have to adjust some of my Godot settings here, but we'll add in a loading button like so, and we'll name it back. And then we're going to double click this guy, name it back like that. And then we're going to duplicate that button and drag it over here. We'll come over here, Control A, call it load like that. We'll double click on this and say load scene button like that. And then we're going to right click, add a child node. We're going to add in a label, rich text label, and we'll drag this guy down over here, probably somewhere right here. We'll say save name. We'll duplicate this. We'll drag it down just a touch, and we'll name it save date like that. So now we'll be able to see our save name and our save date. In Baldur's Gate, what they have is they have an image right here. They have the name and the date. So what we'll do is we'll add in that image. So we'll right click, add a child node. We'll add in a texture rect like that. We will make it nice and large, something like this. And if we drag in the Godot icon so we can see what it looks like, this is what it's going to do. We'll come to stretch and we'll tell it to keep aspect, and that'll basically allow us to keep our aspect ratio of our image, but keep it inside the bounds of this texture rect. And that's going to help us keep our stuff consistent and make it so it doesn't go over top of our little bounds here. Now, I am going to grab these two guys. I'm going to drag them back so that way we have a nice, good, justified setup here. I'm going to double click my rich text labels, name it save name like that. And we're going to name this one save date. So save date like that. And that should do it. Now, when it comes to our panel here, that's going to have a list of our save information, right? Because we said we would do save slots. So since we're doing save slots, we need to have a scroll container with some horizontal layout groups. So we'll hit add child node. We'll come in here and add in a scroll container like that. We'll make it expand to encompass this entire thing. We're going to right click, add a child node. We'll add in a VBox container, and I'm going to name this my load buttons like that. That's going to allow us to list our buttons down so that they can be clicked. And then we'll right click, add in another child node, and we're going to add in a button. And I'm going to name this button load button like that. And I'm just going to put test text like that. And I'm going to come over to my load buttons, and under layout, I'm going to tell it to container size and expand. Now it's going to expand this all the way across. Now, if we want, we can also add a label up here to help the user understand what this section is for. So we'll add in a rich text label. We'll grab it, we'll drag it out like this, and we'll just say saves : like so. We'll put it up here. And then we're also going to duplicate this guy and drag it to the center of our screen. We'll click up here and do a top wide, and that's going to expand it to be at the top of our screen and make it wide. We'll pull this down somewhere in this area here. We might actually want it to go up to the top, and then we'll just say load game. And my caps lock is on, load game. like that. And then we'll come down here and we'll go into and it looks like I can't center align this because I don't know where it is. So if you guys know where center aligning is, let me know, because that's something that still kills me, that I can't seem to find a way to center align text inside of Godot. So I'm going to drag this to the center like this, which is not exactly what I want, but it's, I guess, good enough. And I'll have to drag this like this. And we're going to go down to our theme override. We're going to go to our size right here under font size. I'll do a check mark, and I'm going to change this from 1 to something like possibly 28 or so. So that way we have some kind of thing here. We're going to center align at the top like this, and I'll drag this guy out so I can attempt to center align it just a little bit. There we go. And that's close enough to center. That should just work. Now, once we have this, we're basically ready to get started coding. So to do our save slots, it's actually going to be relatively simple. So if you remember, if we click on project, open user data folder, we drag this over here, you'll see in our saved games, we have our test.json. Now, what we need to do is we need to basically save this out in a subdirectory so that the user has multiple save slots. And then we're going to need to come up with a way to save that button's information, because we have all of this data here. So we're going to need to put that data somewhere. But we don't want to load our entire JSON file, because if we do that, that's going to add a whole bunch of lag into our load menu. When we instance our load menu, would have to load all that JSON information, and that's gonna make it extremely laggy. So what we'll do is we'll come into our code here, we'll go into our save load manager, and when we do our save, let's actually just add a subdirectory. So we'll come in here and we'll say, first things first, when we pass in our name, if not dir exists name, then we'll go ahead and make that dir. And what that's going to do is when a name gets passed in, it's going to make a subdirectory under saved games with that name, if that makes sense. And then we'll come in here and we'll just add in a quote slash plus plus, and we'll add in name. And what that's going to do is it's going to actually add in that subdirectory. So if you take a look at this code, and we do the same with our load, if you look at this code, when we save, it's going to save it as name. So our end state will be saved games test/test.json. So we'll actually have a subdirectory called test.json. So if we hit Control S and we save our load menu, and we go back to our base game and hit play, if we start our game and hit spacebar, we hit inventory save, you'll notice that when I go to my saved games, you'll see that I have a test folder with a test.json. So that's how we're going to handle our save slots. Each save slot will be a folder inside of our saved games section. So basically, all we have to do now is come up with a way to make all of our names unique. And the simplest way to do that is to have some kind of name plus the date/time of their save. And so if we go back to where we save our information, which is right, I believe here, save game test, what we can do is come in here and get a date string. So we can say var s date is equal to str time dot get date time string from system. And that's going to pull back a date time string. So it's going to actually pull back our current date time and basically set that up. Now, something that is a little bit of testing on my part is when you do a date time from your system, it comes in with colons, and colons don't work with your save system on Linux and on, I believe, Mac, because I had some issues with my Mac. So that's something to keep in mind. So what you can do is just type date is equal to date.replace quote colon comma quote dash, and that should just solve that issue. And then when we do our save, we can basically just say test space dash plus date, and that'll basically just pass in our test plus our date. So now if we refresh this and we try it again, we start our game, hit the space bar, hit inventory, save, if we take a look at our information here, you can see we have test 2023-10-15, time is 10:37:54. So I saved this at 10:37 a.m. with 54 seconds left. So that's basically how we can pull that information back. Now you might be asking, okay, so great, we have that. So how can we save our save information, right? We have our actual save slot here, but how do we save our save data? Well, that's actually relatively easy. We can come in here and basically say var save game info is equal to bracket, quote, name, colon, name, comma, and I'm going to do a bit of pre-coding, image path, colon, and I'm just going to go ahead and pass in this information here, copy, paste, and I'm going to change this to .png. And this will become useful in a minute, but I just want to set that up so that way it's already set up. And then we'll come in and add in our date time, colon, time.get Unix time from system. And that'll allow us to get our date time. Because if you remember, we had 3 parameters for our save system. In our load menu, we had only 3. We had the picture, we had the save name, and the save date. So that's where we're going to store that information. So if you had additional information, like if the user had a player name, or if you wanted to display any other statistics like the level that they're on, or if you wanted to show their ammunition or something weird like that, you could definitely do it right here inside of the save game manager. You just basically set it right here. And then just like before, we have to stringify and save our data. So we'll just copy this and paste it. I know this isn't the most ideal. In theory, you could abstract this and make it a bit better, but we'll just go with this for now. We'll pass in our save game info. We'll change this from save JSON to save game JSON. We'll copy this guy and paste it right there. We'll come down here and say save game file, capital F. We'll copy this guy and we'll paste. And then we will come over here and change this to underscore save game.json with file access right. I think that will work. That should work. So we'll hit Control S. And then if we go back to our base game, we refresh it. We go start, escape, inventory, save, close, and we reopen up this guy. In theory, if we go to our save game, you should see another save right here, which means our save slots are working. So great, that's good. If we double click on this, you'll see that we have a save game JSON. I think my preview pane doesn't know how to read JSON, so we'll go ahead and open it up in VS Code real quick. So I'll grab that and drag this guy in. And you'll see if I hit Control-Shift-P, format, you'll see that we have our information as expected. We have our date time in a float format. So the reason why they use floats here is because that's when Unix epoch started. And basically that's from January, I think 1st of 1970. And it's the number of seconds from that point. And I don't really understand why they did it that way, but I'm assuming that there's some kind of reason. But that's basically why this is a integer instead of like a string or a format of some description. It's literally just the number of seconds since 1970. So you can see that we have an image path here, but we don't have an image. So how do we actually handle that? Well, if we head back to our project here, we basically need to tell the game on save, go ahead and hide the UI and take a picture, right? So what we can do is go into our save load manager and we can basically set that up. Now, when we want to hide our UI, if we actually hit play here and we take a look at some things, if we click on start game spacebar, we hit inventory and we click on our remote, you'll see that our inventory is located underneath our player right here. So we should probably pull that out and put it into some kind of UI manager. We should probably put all of our UI under a UI manager. So that way, when we want to hide our UI, we can just tell our UI manager to hide, right? So what we'll do is we'll close this guy. We'll go back to our base game, right click, add in a child node, and let's add in a node. We'll double click on that, Control A, UI manager, and we'll put our button underneath that. We'll actually drag our control underneath that as well. I think level base doesn't really do anything. Yeah, it doesn't really do anything that's useful. And we'll have to relink this button. So we'll disconnect this, connect, and we'll reconnect it to our level base. So that way it's actually connected correctly. But that'll allow us to have our UI manager right here, and that should just work. So now we have to change our inventory to actually be underneath our UI manager as well. So we'll come into our character. I need to reorganize this project, but I believe it's under scenes, character, and we'll come in here and we'll grab our inventory and we'll basically just remove it. So we'll hit delete. We'll go into our base game. We'll come in here, scroll up to our add-ons, FP CGI, inventory system, scenes, and we'll drag our inventory.tscn in like that. We'll hide it. So that way it just exists. And now if we take a look at our player code right here, I believe if we hit Control F, inventory, you'll see that it does $inventory visible, $inventory visible. So if I remember correctly, in our game manager, we have a inventory right here. So we should just be able to come into our character here and just do game manager .inventory.visible. We'll copy that, paste, and in theory that should work. And I'm going to double check my inventory really quick to make sure that my inventory is calling out my game manager here on startup, just to make sure it's good. And it does. So it calls out my inventory. It calls out my game manager right here. So it should just work fine. So I think that will work. And then we should be able to tell this to hide all of these guys. Now, our UI manager is not a type node that can be hidden. So we need to actually come in and tell it that it can be hidden. We're going to right click, attach a script, and we'll add in a UI manager.gd. And this is a good time to register our UI manager with our game manager, right? Because our game manager is our central point of our entire game. So everything flows through that. Anything that's important goes through that first. So we'll go to our game manager. We'll come up here and we'll say var UI manager node, like that. We'll hit Control S. We'll go to our UI manager and we'll say on ready, game manager.UI manager is equal to this, basically. And then we can come down here and say func hide UI, like that. And basically, we're going to need to hide our UI. And this is actually going to be relatively easy. We can just basically say for I in get children, I.hide, like that. And don't forget your colon or else it's not going to work. And then, of course, if you're going to hide, you need to show. So func show UI, like that. For I in get children, I.show, like that. And that'll basically allow us to hide and show our UI. And now we can basically go into our save load manager. We can come in here and hide our UI and take our picture. So we'll say game manager dot UI manager dot hide UI, like that. And then we're going to need to wait for a few frames so that way we can take our photo. So we'll type await get tree dot physics frame, and I'm going to copy and paste that a few times. Now I know that technically there's probably a better way to handle this, but this way works pretty well for me. So I'm going to go with this. Basically what this is going to do is it's going to tell the game to wait, in this case, 5 frames. And that's going to allow everything to kind of draw, run through, and then take your photo. That way you don't have any UI elements inside of your actual photo. So now we basically can just take our photo. So we'll say var screenshot is equal to get viewport dot get texture dot get image, and that's going to pull back our image. And then we'll say screenshot dot save PNG, and we'll pass in where we want to save our PNG. Now, if you remember, we actually set what our PNG was going to be right up here. So we could basically just grab this path, come down here, paste, and then we should be good to go. So we'll hit save. And now if we go into our base game, we can hit play, start game, spacebar, and we have a broken piece right here. If not inventory is visible, so we'll fix that. So we'll say game manager.inventory, like that. We'll refresh, try it again. inventory, you'll see we have this load game. Don't worry, we'll handle that in a bit. We'll click save, and you'll see that when we click save, it doesn't do anything, but we can click on load game. So what's going on? Well, if we take a look at our remote, you'll see that in our UI manager, we still have our control node here with our load game. So this control node is kind of covering our screen and not allowing us to interact with our UI. So that's unfortunate. Why is it doing that? If we take a look at our control code here, you'll see that when we start our game, we just hide our start game UI. So we literally just hide the button that we're pressing, which is not the most ideal. So what we'll do is we'll get rid of that. We'll come down here and say queue free like that. And then we'll basically just come in and we should be good. So we can hit play, start game, spacebar, inventory, save. You'll see the UI is hidden, right? And you'll see that our mouse is a little funky, but don't worry, we'll fix that. We'll come into our test, go back to our saved games, double click on this guy, and you can see we have a PNG of our actual save here. So awesome. That's really great that this actually is working, right? So we have our JSON information, we have our PNG, and then we have our saved data. So great. Now we got to solve some issues, right? When we click on our save, it hides our UI, but it doesn't go back to allowing us to interact with our game. So what's going on here? Well, when we handle our state inside of our character here, right, I believe it's right here, we check if our game manager is visible, and then we have our input mouse mode visible, input mouse mode captured. So we'll add the ability to basically pause and unpause your game. So if we go to our game manager, let's come up here and say var paused, and we'll make that into a Boolean. And actually, I'll make that a capital P because I want it to be a public Boolean. And then I'll come down here and I'll just add a func pause game. And I will say paused is equal to true. And then I'll also say func unpause game. And I will say paused is equal to false. And what I'm going to do when I do my unpause is I want to basically tell my camera controller, my mouse mode, to be captured, so that way it goes back to the way that I would expect it to work. So we'll do that, and we'll expand this quite a bit when we do our pause menu, and we'll get to that in a second. But basically, that's kind of how we'll approach this. So once we have that, all we have to do is go into our save load manager and go game manager dot unpause game. And that will unpause our game and recapture our mouse. So now we should be able to hit play like so, hit start, space, inventory, save, and it will recapture your mouse. So that way you can continue playing your game, and it will also save your game and add in the PNG that we expect. So now the question is, okay, so we got our PNG, we have our pausing working, we have our stuff operating correctly. What do we need to do to actually display the information and the buttons for our load menu? So you can see we have this. How do we actually make this displayable, and how do we actually make it work? Well, that's actually relatively simple, thankfully. So if we right click our load menu, we attach a script to it, and we'll name it loadmenu.gd. That's fine. And what we'll do is we'll come in here and we'll say on ready, let's populate some buttons. So we'll say var p is equal to dir access. And in our ready, what we're going to do is we're going to get our directories at our saved game, because if you look at our saved games here, you can see that we have a bunch of directories. So we're going to pull those directories, and then we're going to instantiate a button and hook up a button for these directories. So we'll say var p dir is equal to dir access dot get directories at quote user colon / saved games. And I want to make sure that I have it capitalized G like that. And then we'll say for I in dir colon. Then what we'll do is we'll instantiate a button for it. Now we don't have access to a button, so what I'm going to do is come up here and create a pack scene for that. So I'll say at export var load button. And I'll make that colon packed scene like that. And then I'll come in here and I'll say var button button is equal to load button dot instantiate like that. And then we'll come in here and we will add that as a child. So we'll say $ load buttons dot add child and button like that. You'll notice I added a space here, and that's because we're going to be setting up some stuff for our load button. Now, what we need to do is when we create our button, we basically need to tell it to house some of our information. Remember, we have all of our info right here in our data, right? Like this. We need to basically tell it to house that information. So if we click on our load button, we can right click it, attach a script, and create a load button right here. Now, our load button will be relatively simple. First things first, it's going to store our save name. So var save name, var date, and var image path. And then how it's going to work is when our user clicks our button, it's going to fire off an event. So I'll say signal load button down. I'm going to pass in my date, comma, my save name, comma, and my image path. And then from there, I can basically set up my button. So I can come in here and say func setup button like that. And I can pass in some data. And then what I'll do is I'll say save name is equal to data.name. Date is equal to time dot get date time from string like that. And we'll pass in our data dot date time like that. And our image path will be equal to our data dot. And if I remember correctly, we called it image path, img path. So we'll say dot img path. Now you'll notice that if I take a look at this data here, this and this basically match up. So if I not do that, if you look at this, this matches up quite well with this. And the reason why is because I'm basically just going to pass in this object here, and it's going to match up all of the data. Now you'll see that we do get an error here saying too few arguments, expected 2 but received 1. That's probably because this is the wrong one. It's get date time. Let's try this again. Dot get date time string from Unix time. There we go. There we go. And that will basically solve that. So what we're going to do is we're going to pass in on setup our JSON data. That's going to get serialized into our button, and then we should be good to go. And what we'll do is we'll right click this guy, save as scene like this, and we'll call it load button. And then we'll go into our scene here. We'll click on our button and we'll say on button down, connect, and we'll fire off our signal. So we'll say load button down. We'll pass in our date, comma, our save name, comma, and our image path. And I forgot to hit dot emit. There we go. And how this is working is basically when we click this button, it's going to fire this function, which is going to emit our signal. And that's going to send back our data parameters that we expect. So we'll be able to pass back our date, save name, and image path. And then from there, we can basically show that information here based off of that button click, if that makes sense. So now if I delete my load button, I click on my load menu, I go to my inspector, you'll see I have a load button. So I can basically just grab that. So if I grab my load button.tscn, drag that guy in there, and then I can actually just come into my load menu and finish setting this up. So when I instantiate my button, I need to actually connect my function, right? Because if you remember, we have a signal right here, right? So what we can do is we can basically connect that to some code inside of our load menu. So we'll say button dot, and the name of it is load button down. So we'll grab that load button down dot connect, and we will pass in some kind of function callback. So we'll say func load button down, or maybe I should probably put on load button down. So on load button down, we'll pass in the date, comma, save name, comma, image path like that. And we'll pass that for now. And we'll come up here and basically say connect this function with that signal like that. And then we can basically just load our data and set up our button. So we'll say var file is equal to file access dot open. And we'll pass in our user : / saved games / plus I plus quote / plus I plus quote. And I believe we did underscore save JSON. And if I double check real quick, we'll open this guy up. Save game.json. So we added a game there. So we'll do that real quick. Game like that. And we need to open it up as a type. So we'll say file access dot read like that. And that's going to allow us to read the data in our file, much like we've done before with our load system. And then from here, all we have to do is say var content is equal to file dot get as text. And then we can actually serialize that as an object. So var obj is equal to JSON dot parse string content like that. And then we can come in here and we can set up our button. So we'll say button dot, and I believe we called it just setup button. Yep, with a capital S. So setup button like that, obj, and that should just work. And then what I'm going to do as kind of a flavor text, but I'm going to set up my button dot text is equal to my obj dot name like that. So in theory, if we play this menu here, so if I run this, we have a crash, so that's not a good sign. My guess is, which file is it attempting to open? For I endure, it's pulling back test, and test doesn't have that information. If you remember, that was our first test. So let's pull back like these. I don't know, this does not have an image. So let's pull back these guys and get rid of them. That way it doesn't crash our game. So we'll just kind of pull these guys back and then we'll refresh it. And you'll see that we have the two buttons. Now, right now, when we click these, it's doing nothing, but we have our two buttons, which is good. That's exactly what we want. So now we just need to set up all the rest of this. So this section right here, right? So when we click on one of these guys, it's going to display this image. It's going to change these guys. So that's actually relatively easy. We have our on load button down right here. So we can basically just say $save name dot text is equal to save name. And then we can hit $save date dot text is equal to date. And then we can do the same thing for our image. So var path is equal to os dot get user data dir plus our image path. Now we have to load our image. So all we have to do is just create a function for that. So I'm going to say func load image texture, and I'm going to pass in a path, and I'm going to make that into a type string. I'm going to hit colon, and then I'm going to say var loaded image is equal to image.new. And then I'm going to say var error is equal to loaded image dot load, and I'll pass in a path. And then I'm going to just check if there's an error. So if error does not equal okay, then basically we can just print image failed to load, and then we can just return. Or we can just return image texture dot create from image like that. We'll pass back our loaded image. Now, something I just thought of is if we just pull this out, we might be able to get away without doing the path. I originally thought we might need to do this and do some adjustments, but let's try doing it directly with the user icon and go from there. So what I'll do is I'll just type load image texture, and I'll just pass in image path like that. And I'll pass, since it passes back an image, we can basically just say $texture rect dot texture is equal to that. And hopefully, if we've done everything correctly, when we refresh our load menu and we click on a box here, it actually shows our image. So perfect, right? That's exactly what we wanted. Kind of. It doesn't quite match up the way that we need it to because the scaling is wrong. So unfortunately, I think I was right the first time. We need to change this to actually be a proper scaling. So I believe we should probably set this to keep height proportional like this, and we can keep aspect. That should be fine. So now if we refresh this and we click, there we go. That's our picture of our game with our title and the date that we actually did it. Now you can also see if we click on our second slot, it actually works. You can see we have two different pictures at two different times. Awesome. Simple enough, right? So now the question is, how do we get our load button to actually operate? Now this is actually relatively easy. Remember how we have in our game manager the ability to load our game. Now I know that if you're coming to this without following the previous tutorials, you might not necessarily have this code. So go ahead and steal it, or of course, go check out my loading screen tutorial and that will walk you through how to set all this up. But you can see here, we have in our game manager the ability to load a level. So all we need to do is hook that up and it will just hopefully just work. Granted, we'll see because sometimes things get real finicky. So we'll come here, and when you click on the load screen button, so this button over here, which is getting hidden by the icon. So let's actually just get rid of that icon. If we look at that load screen button right here, when they click it, it needs to load something, right? So we'll go into our node, button down, and we'll hook it up to our load menu. Now, when we load our game, we need to pass in a title, a path of where we're going, and what the index is. And thankfully, we already kind of have a lot of that information, right? So we're actually relatively okay there, right? So what we should do is we should load our game based off of whichever one we have selected, and then tell the game manager to load the level. So how do we do that? Well, if we come in here, all we have to do is say var obj is equal to saveLoadManager.loadGame. And we can pass in name to load. Now, unfortunately, we don't really have a name to load, right? Because once we got out of our instancing code here, right, we kind of lose the name of our stuff, right? So that means that we need to actually have a variable up here that keeps track of what save to load. So we'll come up here and say save var save to load. And we can come down here and just say save to load like that. And then we have to set that value. So when we click on our button, we can just do save to load is equal to our save name. And that'll basically keep track of what save game we're trying to load. And then from here, we can basically just come down here and set up all of our loading system to work. So what we'll do is we'll come in here and say game manager.load level and pass in our obj. I believe it is game manager, but let's double triple check to be sure. So we'll open up VS Code here and we'll triple check real quick. So Control Shift P, format our document, game manager.scene and game manager.index. So obj.gamemanager.scene, comma, obj.gamemanager. And I believe it's spawn index right here. So we'll pass in spawn index and we will double click on this guy, pass that in, and that should in theory work. Now, something that we should do is we should queue free, because if we don't, it will cause some issues. So now in theory, if we hit play, we click on a save to load, we click load, we hit the space bar, you'll see that we get a crash here because level base add child. That doesn't exist because we're doing it from the load menu, but it did at least attempt to load our stuff. So our code is operating correctly, or at least relatively correctly. So what that means is we can go to our base game and just kind of set up our load button right here. which is underneath our control node. So right here, you can see we have our loading screen. You can see we have our load game button. When we press our load game button, we need to actually, instead of just loading our test scene, we can come in and open up our load menu. So to do that, we'll need to basically hijack this load main menu over here, and we'll need to basically change this code out. Now, the way that I'm thinking I'm going to approach it is by coming down here, grabbing my load menu, which I believe is right here, load menu.tscn. We'll drag that guy in, and on click, we'll hit $load menu dot show, and we'll show our load menu, and I'll just hide this guy like that. And then we need to basically do the exact same thing but the opposite, right? So if a user wants to hide this menu, right, so if they click on their load menu and they click the back button, we need to hide it. So we'll click on our back, we'll do button down, we'll hook this to our load menu, on back button down. And what I'm going to do, instead of actually just hiding this, what I'm going to do is make this raise an event. And the reason why is because that'll make this code reusable in the future. And as with most things, you're going to want your code to be reusable in the future. So what we'll do is we'll come up here to the top, and we're going to make two signals. We're going to have a loading level, and we're going to have a signal called hide interface. We'll come down here, and what we'll do is we'll just say hide interface.emit like that. And then I'm going to also do the same thing here. So when a user hits the load button, I'm going to say loading level.emit. And this will become apparent why I'm doing this in a second, but trust me, this will be really useful. So we'll head back to our main menu. We'll come down here. You see how we're doing our load menu show. When we come to our ready, hit $load menu dot, and we'll put in our event. So I believe that's going to be called our loading level. So we'll grab that real quick, loading level dot connect, and we'll connect that to a function. And the function that we'll have is func on load level like that. And whenever we load our level, we'll just queue free. That way we can just eliminate our sub menu here. We can just completely take it out. So our entire main menu just gets removed. And we'll do the same thing when there is a I believe we used hide interface. So we'll grab that, hide interface connect, and we'll basically just grab this func on underscore hide underscore interface like that. And we'll just hit $load menu dot hide. Now you might be wondering why I'm doing it this way, and basically it's just to try to keep my stuff to be flexible, right? I don't want my stuff to have to direct reference things as much because it can cause problems. So we'll do that, and that should help with making things just kind of be a bit more flexible. Now in theory, if we go to base game and we hit play, you'll see that we have an invalid get index loading level on base null. My guess is if we go to main menu, load menu, let's see. I'm getting some kind of error when I save. It looks like this is not getting saved. Couldn't save scene something. So I think Godot is unhappy with me, and it doesn't really tell me why. So what I'll do is close this and don't save. And then I'll reopen my main menu.tscn, which seems to be invalid now. So we'll show it in File Manager, and let's take a look at it. So Godot seems to have corrupted my main menu, which is not ideal. I mean, granted, the code is not super complicated, but let's take a look as to why. So main menu.gd, load screen.tscn. That's probably fine. I mean, it looks basically normal. One of the cool features of VS Code is I have this nice tool here, which is my get lens. So I can just click back and take a look to see what possibly has changed. we added a load game button, and that's pretty much it. Yeah, so there's no reason why this should be corrupted. So let me close Godot. Almost everything can be solved in Godot by closing it. So we'll close it. I'm going to go over to my downloads. I'll come down to Godot stable 411 mono 64, which is the version I'm using right now. We'll grab the stable mono console, which will give me access to the Godot console. I'm going to open this up and take a look at it. Base game TSCN, the file could have been moved. Let me see. Base game.tscn. Okay. Cannot open file loading screen TSCN. Failed loading resource main menu. Does main menu exist? Yes. Load menu exists. Loading screen. Okay, so it looks like I deleted my loading screen. I think that's what bricked it. So let me open up GitHub desktop. And this is one of the big reasons why I tell people when you do your stuff, make sure you use Git, because it will back up your stuff and make it so that you don't lose data. You see, I deleted this. If I go to discard and I discard my change, that should fix the majority of my issues. So now I should be able to go into base game and it picks it up just fine. So just keep that in mind and make sure that you guys, back up your stuff. So I'm going to drag this guy into my load menu.tscn. I'm going to drag this guy in, hide it, and then I should be okay to save. Go to base game, hit play. And we have a crash, invalid function connect on base signal. And that's because it's expecting 2 arguments because I completely spaced on the 2 arguments. So we'll copy load on load level and we'll copy on hide interface. We'll refresh it. Click load game. You'll see that we have R2. We'll click this guy. We'll click load. And it's loaded our game. Awesome. So that's pretty much how we do all of our saving system pretty much. Now, next, what we're going to talk about is how to add a pause menu. And then finally, we're going to talk about how to actually expand this into being something a bit more flexible. So for us to be able to handle a pause menu, that's actually relatively simple. Pause menus, thankfully, are quick and easy to work with. So what we'll do is we'll go to scene, new scene. We're going to create a user interface scene. And we're going to make something super quick because I don't want to make a crazy, gigantic tutorial like I usually do. So we'll right click, add in a panel, and we'll make this guy full screen. We'll right click, add in a child node, add in a VBox container. We're going to center align this guy. And then let's just kind of pull this up and make it into a basic main menu size. We'll center align it. We'll pull this guy down a little bit. We'll right click, add in a child node. We're going to add in a rich text label. We'll center upper align that. We'll drag this guy down. We'll put in our inspector paused like so. And then we'll recenter align it and pull it up. There we go. In our VBox container, we'll just right click, add in a child node, add in a button. And then we'll just name this button resume, and then we'll just duplicate this button 5 times. We'll name this one as save. We'll name this one as load. We'll name this one settings, which we won't get to in this tutorial, and then we'll name this one exit. And then we can rename these guys as well. So exit, settings, load, save, and resume. Like that. And then we can go ahead and add in our load menu.tscn because we're going to need that. So that way, when the user clicks load, they're going to be able to show their load menu. Now, much like before, what we're going to do is we're going to come up here, name this pause menu. We're going to right click, attach a script. We're going to call it pause menu.gd. That's fine. And what we'll do is we'll hook up all of our buttons. So we'll say on button down, we'll connect these guys so that they get auto added into our project. And exit. Now we'll do exit first because exit's the fastest out of the group. When you want to exit, you just want to quit. So get tree.quit like that. On options, we're going to ignore that because we don't really want to change our settings. So don't worry about that. For our loading button, this is where things will get a little bit more interesting. So we want to show our load menu. So we'll hit $ show load menu dot show like that. And then we'll also want to make sure that our closing and loading get connected. So on our ready, we'll just basically do that. So what I'm going to do is go into my main menu and I'm going to grab both of these guys, copy them, go to my pause menu, paste, go to my main menu. We'll grab these guys. We'll come in here, we'll paste it, and that should solve these guys pretty well. Now, when we want to load a level, we are going to queue free. And I think that queuing free might just work for us. So we'll control S, we'll save this as pause menu. And let me see. On resume, when we click on resume, we're going to need to be able to pause and unpause our stuff. So we'll say game manager.unpause game like that. And down here on save button down, we want to actually hook up our save. So if you remember, we had a save under our base game, I believe, under level base or under the UI manager. Let me see. This button is hooked up to our level base, and here's how it's saving. So we'll just control X that. We'll go into our pause menu. We'll paste that in. So that way we actually have it in some kind of menu. And then we'll come to our base game. We'll delete our button so we don't have that anymore, and we'll pull out this function so we're not wasting some space here. But in theory, that should do it. And what we'll want to do is basically when we hit the escape button, we want to tell our pause menu to show, right? And the best way to do that is actually with our UI manager. If you remember, we have this UI manager and its job is to keep track of our different instances of things. So what we should do is when you hit escape, you instance that pause menu. So I'm going to create a reference. So export var pause menu. I'm going to make that a pack scene like that. And then I'm going to have a var current pause menu. And I'm going to make that into a node like so. Then I'm going to create a function that allows us to send out a pause menu. So func pause like that. If not game manager dot paused, then current pause menu is equal to pause menu dot instantiate like that. And that's going to instance our spawn menu. And then I'm going to add a child to our UI manager as our current pause menu. And then I'm going to else, and I'm going to say current pause menu dot queue free like that. And what this is going to do is when we call pause, it will basically check to see if we're paused. And if we are, it will spawn a pause menu. If not, then it will remove that pause menu. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to backtrack into my game manager. And I'm going to come in here. And I'm going to go UI manager dot pause like that. And then I'll come in here, copy it, and paste it. And in theory, if I go to my character, I'll be able to say on escape, pause, right? So we'll come up here. We'll find wherever we're doing our input. So get input. Here's all of our input stuff. If we come into the bottom here, if input.isAction just pressed, and we'll say pause, colon, if game manager dot paused, then game manager dot unpause game, else game manager dot pause game like that. And then we just have to hook up our actual button. So we go to project settings, we'll come into input map, and we'll type pause. I believe that's what we called it. And we'll hit enter, and then we'll scroll down, hit the plus icon, hit escape. Okay. And there we go. That's going to hook up our pause. We'll hit close. Then if we hit play, we go to start game, spacebar, we run over here, hit escape, and we have crash. Now, this is actually my fault. So it's instantiating null because pause menu never got it set up. So we'll hit stop. We click on our UI manager and look at our inspector. You'll see that our pause menu is empty. We actually need to set that to something for this to work. So we'll drag our pause menu into here. We'll hit Control S. We'll hit play. We'll click start game. We'll run over here, hit escape, and there is our menu. Now you'll notice that we can't actually use our mouse. Our character won't allow us to. That's because when we do our pausing, we actually don't set what our mouse controls are like. And when you pause your game, you need to make it so that your mouse controls are visible. So we'll come in here and we'll say input.mouse mode is equal to mouse mode dot visible. And then we'll do the same thing when we unpause mouse mode captured. So now anytime we pause, our mouse is actually visible. So we should be able to just refresh, start game, spacebar, escape, and you will see that our mouse actually works. But you also notice that our character can look around. So why is that? Well, that's because whenever we pause our game, we need to stop all user interaction. So basically, to handle that, what we have to do is just check, hey, are we paused? If we are, don't do anything. So what we'll do is we'll come into our character. We'll go all the way up to where our physics process is. We'll say if game manager.paused, then return. And then we'll do the exact same thing for our input. So if we scroll down to where our input is located, where we say get, let me see, input event, if game manager pause, return. And in theory, that should solve our problem. So if we hit play, start game, escape, you can see that we no longer can interact. If we hit spacebar or anything like that, it's all perfectly paused. We click resume, we can once again move around as if it is unpaused. We can escape, no longer can move around. If we click save, it unpauses our game so we can move around as if nothing changed. In theory, that means that if we go into our editor or project, open user data folder, we should have a saved game that is today. You'll see that I actually recorded this in a different session, but that's okay. You can see our pause right there. And then if we hit escape, load, you will see that it has our load right here. And something that we should probably add is maybe like a blocker here, or maybe we could hide our buttons and things like that. But if we click, you can see our different saves that we have. If we hit back, you can see our load menus here. If we click load and we load where we would expect. Although I can't move, so that's not a good sign. So that means that we must be paused when we load. So let's take a look at our loading system. So what we should do is take a look at our game manager and actually see when we load a level, do we unpause? Because remember, everything is based off of our game manager. So if we head over to our game manager, we should probably check to see if we're paused. So if paused, then unpause game. So that way, when we load our game, if we are paused and we may have been loading from a different state, we can actually just unpause our game. Although I guess what we should probably do, now that I'm thinking about it, is if we do this, that's going to fire off a load level. That's not going to actually start our game. So I'm curious if we should go to our load screen, and once we do our input and we change our scene right here, we should probably unpause our game. So actually, we should probably just do it here. So game manager dot unpause game. If it's already paused, it shouldn't be a problem to run this. So we should be able to try that. Hit start game, spacebar, and for some reason, our menu has decided to be shown. So let me see, is it because, did I display it for some reason? Or could it be because of our load screen? Unpause should, that's because we're calling UI manager pause. So it's thinking that we're trying to pause the game, even though we're not. So what we should probably do is split apart our UI manager into two. So I'll just do unpause like that. Or maybe I could just pass in a true and a false like that. And then we can go to our UI manager dot pause, pass in a Boolean of paused, and then just say if paused, then do that. I think that'll be a bit better. Plus it abstracts it a bit. So basically the reason why we're having issues is because I have this as kind of like a toggle switch, right? So if we're not paused, it's going to pause the game. And because we were just not paused on game start, when it got to this point, it just said, oh, we should pause, even though we didn't need to. So that's the reason why this was having a problem. So now in theory, this should just work. We can go here, start game, spacebar, cannot call queue free on null method. That's because we don't have a pause menu. If not, if current pause menu, then remove it. We should probably practice some defensive coding. So that way, if our current pause menu exists, then queue free it. If it doesn't, then don't. So that way we don't have these issues. Start game, spacebar. We can run around like an idiot. We can hit escape, load, 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 spacebar. And we're calling queue free on a previously freed instance. This should be null. So do I need to say does not equal null? Maybe that will do it. So we'll try that again. We'll hit escape, load, click, load, space. There we go. And it's loaded. Awesome. So that's basically how we can make a pause menu. Now all we have to do is expand our system. So now we're going to go beyond the original design, right? The original design says, hey, we're going to save our stuff like this, and that's all we're going to do. But now we're going to step into doing something a bit more complicated. What we're going to do is we're going to save our entire system state and load that on project load. So all this does is it's a very basic save, right? It just says, hey, which level was I? Which index? So it doesn't save where the player is. It doesn't save your inventory. It doesn't save object positions. It doesn't do anything like that. And that's something that we need to have in our game for it to work properly. So how do we actually build that? So for us to expand this system, what we need to do is basically make it so that each can basically save itself. And what I mean by that is when we save, we're going to want to save all of our stuff as basically objects, right? We'll come into our character and we'll click on our character script here. So what we're going to do is we're going to basically put it a part of a group, right? And then we will have it as a group called something like savable, right? And then we'll basically get all of our objects in that scene in a group. And then what we'll do is we'll save all of that data out using a function inside of our actual script here. So what I'm going to do is come down here and say func save like that. And then I'm going to pass, and I'm going to make a func called load. I'm going to pass in data, and I'll pass. These two functions are basically going to run, and it's going to save and load our data. And the way that this is going to work is basically we'll create an object. So we'll say var data is equal to bracket bracket. And then we'll basically call out what we're going to save. So we're going to save our position. And we're going to make that equal to our global position. We're going to save our rotation. And we'll make that a rotation degrees. And if there's anything else that we want to save, like if we're crouching or if we have our flashlight up or something like that, we can go ahead and add that in right here. And then all we have to do is just return that object like that. And it should just save it just fine. Now, something that we'll have to do is we need to use a function called var toString like that. And then we'll need to do the same thing with rotation degrees, var toString like that. And what we should probably do is we should add in some way to find our actual object. So I'm going to say name, and I'm going to use the get path method like that. And that's going to basically give me the node path to this object and allow me to go and fetch that specific object, which is really important because it's going to allow us to basically uniquely identify our objects. And now under load, we'll basically do the same thing. So we'll just grab this stuff and we'll just do the opposite. So global position is equal to str to var, and we'll pass in data dot position like that. And then same thing with rotation. So rotation degrees is equal to str to var, and we'll say data dot rotation like that. And that's how we'll handle our save and our load system. It's going to be relatively simple. Now, once we have this, all we have to do is click on our character, go to our node, add it to a group, and we'll add it to savable like that. And I'm going to copy that name so that I can use it later. And then when we want to save our stuff, so if we go over to our save load manager here, what we can do is we can just come down here after we save our game info. We can say after we do all of this stuff, just before we get into our hide UI and all of this stuff, just before we unpause our game, what we can do is come in here and say for I in get tree dot get nodes in group, and we'll pass in savable. For all of those nodes, we'll need to assign it to an object. So we'll come up here, var objs is equal to bracket bracket, and we'll say objs I dot name is equal to I dot save like that. And then from here, we can basically serialize that object. So we'll say var scene objects is equal to bracket bracket quote objs colon objs like that. And then we can basically just do exactly what we've been doing here. So I can basically just copy this bit of code here, copy it, and come down here, paste, and say scene, we'll say scene JSON like that. And we will pass in objs. We will call this scene file like that. We'll come down here to save game, and we'll just say scene like that, because that's our scene data. So that's why I'm calling it scene. And then we'll pass in our scene JSON. We'll pass in that. And in theory, that should just work. So to test this, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go into my interactable object. If you remember, we have an interactable object in, if I close all of these guys, if I go to my level 1 wake up, which is under scenes, and I do desperately need to reorganize this project, but if I come in here and I take a look at this object here, which is a level 1 grabbable object, if I click on it and I come in here, I add it to savable like that. I click on this guy, I add in a save and load. So func save like that, func load like that. If we come in here and we just do return bracket bracket, and we basically just say, okay, our position, our rotation, and I think that should do it. And then for loading, we'll just do the exact same thing, but the opposite. So we'll pass in our data like that. And we'll say global position is equal to data.position. And rotation degrees is equal to our data.rotation degrees. And we'll also need to do, much like we did with our character, our var to str, because I completely forgot about that. So we'll paste those guys in like so, and we'll close them. And then same thing with our character, str to var, because again, I forgot about that. So we'll pass that in real quick like so, and we'll pass that in real quick like so. There we go. And now in theory, if we go to our base game, we hit play, we hit start game, spacebar, we run over here, escape, save. We possibly have some errors, so let's see. Inventory, that's fine. I don't care about inventory issues. If we take a look at our last save, which was right here, you'll see that we have a scene.json. So if I open up my thing here and I take a look at it, Control-Shift-P, format my document, you'll see that we have a grabbable object. We have its position, its rotation, and then we have our node 3D. Now, something that we're going to need to keep track of is we are using our name here. We might want to use our path instead, potentially, or we might need to make this a unique identifier, maybe an additional check just in case. But we should, at minimum, pass in our path as well. So we'll say name, get path. Like that. That way it just has that information. And right now it's not going to cause any problems, but because of the way that we're saving our data, we're using our name to keep track of which object is which. So we want to be cautious if it's got the same name twice. So for some reason, two people have grabbable object, then that might cause a problem. So we need to differentiate this somehow. And in my case, I'm going to use the path to kind of do that. Now, what we can do is when we hit load, we can load those paths, right? Those spots. So we'll come into our loading save load manager. And I'll come down here, and you'd think that we would come in here and load it here, right? Because, well, why not? That would make sense. But unfortunately, we really can't, okay? Because when we are loading our game, we're actually just parsing our data here. So loading the data is not going to be able to directly reference like this. What we need to do is we need to actually parse the data and have a custom load scene data function, if that makes sense. So what we'll do is we'll actually build a special function specific to loading our scene data. We'll come in here, we'll say func load scene data, and we'll pass in a name. And we'll basically copy and paste this guy right here. So we'll literally just pull this guy, we'll paste it, and then we'll just come in here and change this to our scene data. So we'll just say underscore scene like that, .json. And we should be relatively good in our load save manager. Now, something else that we might want to do is we need to inform the rest of our world that we're actually loading something, right? So when a load happens, our game manager needs to know that that's what's happening. And unfortunately, right now, our game manager doesn't have any way to determine, is the system actually loading stuff? And we need to know that to be able to actually do our load system. So we'll add in a variable here. We'll make that into a Boolean like that. And then we can just check if we're loading from save, then load our scene objects, if that makes sense. Now, how do we know if we're loading from save? Well, thankfully, we really only do that in two specific spots, right? We basically do it when we click on our load button from one of two spots. We do it in our load menu, in our pause menu, and in our main menu. But thankfully, both of those guys are located in the exact same spot, which is our load menu. So if we come in here, you'll see when we click on load button down, we come in here, we save, we load our texture, we have this, and then we have this load scene button down. And this is where we emit our loading level.emit. Now, we could do one of two things. We could either tell this to go directly to our game manager, which we already are right here. So it doesn't really matter if we directly reference our game manager. So we'll say game manager dot loading from save, and we'll make that equal to true. And that'll basically just say, hey, we're loading from save on load. So just make sure that before you, and actually I'm going to drag this above. Now that I'm thinking about it, we'll drag that above. So that way it actually loads from save before we do our load level, just in case things get a little funky, we'll have that. Now, the nice thing is once we have this, we basically can just check this to see if we're loading from save. And if there's anything that's special that we need to do, we can just do it. So now all we have to do is tell our scene manager to basically load that stuff. And if you remember, our level 1 wake up had a scene manager, okay? And right now, that's the best way that we're going to do it. Ideally, we wouldn't do it necessarily in our scene manager, but we would have our scene manager extended from something, right? So we would have our level 1 wake up extended from a scene manager class, and then we'd use that. But for right now, in this specific tutorial, we'll say func load level data like that. And I'm going to pass that for right now. And we'll basically just call it if we are loading from scene or from saved game. So func underscore ready if game manager dot loading from save, then load level data like that. And then from here, we can basically just load our stuff and set all of our stuff up. So we can say var data, we'll make that a dictionary, is equal to save load manager dot load scene data. And we can pass in what we want to load. And now that I'm thinking about it, we might not want to do it that way because I'm passing in the name here, but really I'm looking at this and we have a loaded game up here. So what I'm thinking is if we come down here, right before we unpause our game, if we go loaded game is equal to name, then we don't need to pass in for our scene a name, right? And we can just grab our loaded game. That way it's consistent and there's no way that we could make a mistake. And it's all within the single file. And we're not expecting people to pass in the correct data because that could cause problems. So if we go back to our scene manager here, instead of passing in anything, we just won't. And then we'll basically say for I in get tree dot get nodes in group. And we'll pass in save able, and then we'll come in here and say if I.name in data, then we can go ahead and load it. So I.load, because we expect everyone to follow that naming convention, this should just work. Data bracket bracket I.name like that. And in theory, this should just operate, I hope. So what we'll do is we'll come in here, we'll refresh, we'll click say start game. We'll grab this object. If you remember, we made this object interactable. We'll throw it like that. Well, I threw it really far. So we'll come over here, escape, save, escape, load. We'll grab the last one, load, spacebar. And we have a crash. Invalid index rotation degrees. That's because this is rotation, not rotation degrees. So that's my fault. So if we refresh this, we click load, we click this guy, load, spacebar. The object is not there. So if we come over here, the object's in the right spot. So great. We have this at least somewhat working. Now the question is, why did our player not work? So that's unfortunate because our player's right here, but our node is node 3D. Is our player not a part of the right group? It is. It's a part of the correct group. So our player must not be part of the scene. It's not. So it's outside in our base game under player. So that means that when we load, we're going to need to actually load it on level load. So let's take a look at that. So I think what we'll do is we'll go into our load screen here. We have a spot right here where we check for our player and we instance it. And that's actually after we come in and instance our scene. So what I'm thinking is we could come in here and basically just grab this, Control X, and then once we add our level base in, so we can just basically come up here and say, right before we add our base, our level in, we can come in here and just check for our player and add our player. And then we can say if not game manager dot loading level, then we can go ahead and move our player. And that should solve our problem, at least in theory. So we'll see how that goes. So we'll hit play, then we'll load our game, click on right here. Hopefully that will spawn us right here. Load, spacebar, and there we are. Awesome. So that's pretty much how we can make a flexible loading system. And the nice thing about this system is it's just as easy as adding in the ability to load it. You just come to the object. So for instance, we'll do it with this object real quick. If we go to the object, the door, which is an interactable door, I believe we have it as, we could actually just come in here, add it as a part of the saveable group. We'll come in here. We come down here. we can just grab with our grabbable object. We could basically just grab this, copy it, paste it, and then basically just use that as our saving system. We can hit enter and literally just add door open as well, because we want to make sure that we keep that state. So we'll say var str to string and just do door open like that. And then we can basically say door open is equal to str to var data dot door open like that. And now in theory, if we come to our base game, we refresh it, we hit start game. Well, we spawned over here, which is a bug. But if we open up our door, grab our block here, we throw that block like that, we hit escape, we click save, we escape, exit our game, hit play. If we load our game and we find the right load spacebar, you'll see that, well, we saved in our area, so it replayed that event. So that's something that we'll have to keep in mind and fix, but it works. So save, escape, load, click, load, spacebar, and we are exactly where we left. Now you'll see if I come back, it replays that, and that's the reason why it played that. So we could fix that by basically just going into our level 1 wake up, going into our event. I believe it was, let me see, this guy here, child open door slow. You'll see that we have a E on child open door. So we could basically add a load and save to this and then keep track of these two Booleans just like that. And it would basically solve our problem. So we could basically grab these guys, come in here, paste them, change this to E room slow like that, paste that like that, and I'll grab child room laugh as well. And that's basically all we have to do. And then we just click on our node, which is the one that has this because it's our level 1 wake up, groups, and then just say savable, Control S, hit the play icon, hit the base game, go to play, hit start, spacebar. This is a bug, so we'll fix that in a second. We'll come over here, we'll run this event. We'll hit escape, save game, escape, exit, play, load game, click, load, spacebar. And then if we walk through it, it doesn't do it anymore. And that's how we can build a really flexible save system. Now, something that we have to fix is when we start our game, if we come in here and we hit play, you'll notice that when we start our game, we spawn here. Now, that's because we're spawning at 0, 0. At least I believe that's where that is. So if we go here and we look at where 0, 0 is, that's right here. That is our node location. So our object is getting moved to 0, 0, and that is what's happening to our player. So my guesstimate is what's going on is if we look at our game manager real quick. So we go to our script, we go to game manager. When we do our move player, I'm curious if it's not passing in the correct move player, or maybe there's something going on. When we hit play, let me see. Well, let's do a breakpoint here and let's see what this is doing. So we'll refresh like so. We'll hit start game, we'll hit spacebar, and it's not even running our move player. So that is a problem. So let's go to our game manager and let's see what's going on here. So we go to our game manager. This isn't running. So move player is no longer running. So that's not a good sign. So that means that this must not be running. If game manager is not loaded level, let me refresh this. Is game manager loaded level? Let's see. Game manager, level base. Loaded level, loading from save. That's why. If it's not loading from save, that should solve our problem. And then hopefully we can wrap this up. So we'll hit refresh, start game, spacebar, and we have a breakpoint, and now we're in the correct spot. So now we can grab this guy, providing that I can. There we go. We'll move it over here. We'll throw it. We'll let this open. Hit escape, save, escape, exit. Then we'll hit play. We'll click load. We'll click on our test. and we'll load spacebar. And there we go. And the event doesn't play again because we already played it. And there we are. It all works. Awesome. So that's basically how we build a really flexible and usable save system inside of Godot. Now, I should probably pull all this out into a separate tutorial that's fully separate, but that's the gist of how we do it within our horror game. So we went through how to save and load. We went through how to create a very flexible save system. We talked about how to actually do save slots and to take a picture of your save. We talked about how to manage different states, and we created a pause menu for our game. So if you like this video, go ahead and hit that like button. Hey, if you dislike this video, go ahead and hit that dislike button because I'm here to make content for you guys. This video was a viewer suggested video, so if you have any suggestions, please leave them in the comments below or throw them on my GitHub. Link is in the description, and I'll be more than happy to take a look at it. I am currently looking at Steam integration for GD script, so look forward to that. That'll be a fun one. I have achievements working. I'm just looking at some of the more nuanced features that exist. So it's mostly there, but just needs a little bit more time. And hey, if you have any questions or comments, leave them in the comments below or jump on my Discord. The link is in the description, and anybody there will be more than happy to help you out. But that is all I have for you guys today. So thank you so much again for watching, and I will see you all next time. Thanks.